What follows is a brief construction montage.
Flashback. End of flashback. Soon after, montage.
Yesterday, meanwhile, back in the lowlands.
A few moments later.
Moments later.
Moments later.
More moments later.
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 Later. In the void.
A little later.
Much later.
Much later.
Much later.
Much later. The following Thursday.
Later that same evening.
Just then. By sheer coincidence.
12 o'clock midnight. 3:28 a.m.
7:59 a.m.
8:01 p.m.
10 seconds later.
12 seconds later.
1 minute 37 seconds later.
2 very boring minutes later. 5 minutes later.
5 minutes later.
5 minutes later.
11 minutes later.
15 minutes later.
20 minutes later.
A few minutes later.
A little longer than a few minutes later.
1 hour later.
1 hour later.
1 hour later.
1 hour later.
2 hours later.
2 hours later.
2 hours later.
2 hours later. 2 hours later.
2 hours later.
2 hours later. 2 hours later.
3 hours later.
3 hours later.
3 hours later.
3 hours later.
5 hours later.
346 minutes later. 6 hours later. 6 hours later. 6.5 hours later.
7 hours later.
8 hours later.
8 hours later.
Approximately 10 hours later. Several song-filled hours later.
Many hours later.
Many unbearable hours later. Tomorrow for sure.
24 hours later.
24 hours later.
Early the next morning.
The next morning. The next morning.
The next morning.
The next morning.
The next day.
The next day. The next day.
The following day.
Tomorrow.
The very next evening.
Day 2.
48 hours later.
2 days later. Day 3. 72 hours later. 3 days later.
3 days later.
3 days later. 3 days later. Day 4.
4 to 6 days later.
4 to 6 more days later. Several days later.
1 week later.
1 week later.
2 weeks later.
16 paranoia-filled days later. 3 weeks later. 3 weeks later. 4 to 6 weeks later. 6 months later.
Several months later.
Many months later.
70 years later.
75 years later.
2,000 years later.
3,000 years later.
1 eternity later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had...
Graduation day.
Epilogue.
Epilogue. We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage.